on the agenda is Mrs. Honeyball's report on sexual exploitation and prostitution and its impact on gender equality. And the rapporteur has 4 minutes.
Thank you, President, and thank you, colleagues, and thank you to all the shadows and to the various NGOs and groups I've worked with, the European Women's Lobby, Equality Now, various networks of women who have survived working in prostitution, and the European Commission Anti-Trafficking Coordinator. My report is based on 2 directives, or takes as its basis 2 directives, the directives on victims of violence, which came out in 2012, and trafficking in 2011. Because it's very clear that trafficking fuels prostitution and prostitution fuels trafficking, and that is one of the main reasons why prostitution is a cross-border issue and why it is something that we should be deeply concerned about in this Parliament. There are also, of course, health implications which matter as well. So I am very pleased to have this opportunity to introduce this report. And it has been a controversial and difficult subject because the laws regarding prostitution, as opposed to the overall trafficking, the overall strategy and what we are doing with cross-border issues, the actual laws belong to member states and rightly are the competence of member states, and they vary enormously. In certain countries like the UK, prostitution itself is not illegal, but everything concerning it is. So soliciting, procuring, running a brothel and associated activities are all criminal offences. In some countries, prostitution is completely legal, and that is the case in Germany and the Netherlands. So we are dealing with a very varying perspective, and this has made this report not difficult, but something that has to take account of all of the different traditions across the European Union. But I think one thing has been clear, and that is that very, very, very few women work in prostitution totally as a matter of free choice. During the course of my work for this, I have met many survivors and talked to many people who work in prostitution in various forms, and I did not actually meet one woman who had chosen it as a matter of completely free choice. As I said before, many had been the victims of trafficking, and in fact official EU research says that 62% of those who are trafficked in the EU are women trafficked for sexual exploitation. Very often they are very young women, very often they are girls, and that in itself is appalling enough. In addition to victims of trafficking, there are those who have drug and substance abuse habits. There are many, an unquantifiable number, because statistics are very difficult to find in this area, but many of those who work in prostitution have had very difficult and disturbed backgrounds, who have suffered sexual abuse when they are young, and many, in times of economic crisis particularly, are turning to prostitution through poverty. None of those, I contend, are free choices, and prostitution is not a job like any other. In fact, prostitution is absolutely against gender equality, which is why in my report I am suggesting that we take very seriously the model which is used in Sweden, the Nordic model as we know it, whereby the buyer of sexual services is the one who is criminalised. This has been shown to reduce levels of prostitution in Sweden since 1999, when it was introduced, by half, a very significant decrease in prostitution. And I believe that the way of tackling prostitution and reducing it is to reduce demand. And the only model that is shown to do this is the model which is currently operating in Sweden. So I therefore call upon all of you to support this very important report.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mrs. Honeyball. So now we have the catch the eye procedure, and I've got once again many more requests than we've got time for, and I'm going to have to take into account who's spoken previously and need to keep an eye on the nationalities and also their group strengths. So we'll start with Mrs. Zaborska.
Thank you, Chair. Let me express my support to colleague Honeyball and the text of the report that was adopted in the committee. The term prostitution clearly contains trading with human beings. One person buys another person in order to satisfy his pleasure. Whether it is illegal or forced prostitution, the principle is the same. Regarding human being as merchandise shall be prohibited. I hope we agree on that. I am aware that my position will not be agreed, especially by those colleagues whose member states have legalized prostitution. Even the European Court of Justice declared that the prostitution is a profession like any other. I don't support the draft alternative resolution. I hope we will manage to pass the Honeyball report, and as a shadow rapporteur, I will do my best in order to find a text that will be supported by my group.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Zaborska. Mrs. Esterle next.
Thank you, President. Prostitution affects 40 to 45 million people across the world, the huge majority of whom are women. This is a situation which is the cause and the consequence of gender inequality. It's been proven that economic problems, social exclusion, poverty are the main causes of prostitution, and that pimping is closely linked to organised crime. The prostitution market increases the trafficking in women and children. There's a huge disparity in the way in which the member states deal with this issue. Some believe that prostitution is a violation of women's rights, a form of sexual slavery, which perpetuates gender inequality. Others state that women have the right to do whatever they wish with their own bodies. The Nordic Model seems to be the best safeguard of women's dignity, but it's vital that we promote the proper police and judicial protection systems. Prostitution cannot be just seen as a profession. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Estrella. Mrs. Lunacek next.
Thank you, Chair. Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen, Madam Honeyball in her report, in my view, in the view of a majority in my group, presents a very one-sided position and doesn't take into account the different approaches that we have inside the European Union. It demands to criminalise prostitution. And as a feminist, yes, I also have a problem with the fact that in our patriarchal society, too many men all too often look at women as objects for sex, for work or for other things, and not as dignified human beings in their own right. But criminalisation, as in the Nordic model, doesn't solve the problems, colleagues. We need to differentiate between trafficking for sexual exploitation in prostitution or in households or wherever, and sex works resulting from active individual decision. I know some women decide to go into sex work because of economic hardship they encounter, but it's their decision and their choice. So together with members of other political groups, we propose an alternative motion for resolution which focuses on the responsibility of member states and especially also on providing exit strategies for those who want to leave prostitution. Please support the...
Thank you, Mrs. Lunacek. Mrs. Suber. Thank you very much. 82% of the women prostituted in the world are women. Prostitution clearly leads to more inequality between men and women, and without a doubt it's a form of brutal violation. It's not a genuine profession. It's a form of violence against women. It reflects social and economic inequality is caused by capitalism. Capitalism feels everything should be bought and sold, including privacy. It treats women as goods and takes the profits of pimps and procurers, where in the countries where prostitution is legal now become honest businessmen. In a progressive society, individual work should contribute to society. What should we think of a woman who sells her dignity for the satisfaction of men? She has to be mistaken. Abolitionism has been defended in this report. Women are considered to be victims. They need to be protected, and we need to criminalise those who are in fact working against women, who exploit them, the clients.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you, Mrs. Suber. Now, Mrs. Jobo.
Wo sitzt er?
Mr. Schöbro.
Dziękuję, panie przewodniczący.
Thank you, Chairman. If we are to be efficient combating prostitution, all sorts of sex agencies, etc., we need a very stringent law, something which would serve as deterrent. We must also remember that in some countries the law is very stringent, but there are difficulties with its implementation. We also need to make sure that we understand that the provisions of law are available and need to be implemented. In Poland, women sell themselves, particularly to the lorry drivers along the roads in Poland. They typically come from the southern Europe, and they are abused in squalid conditions. We must make sure that we combat this phenomenon.
Thank you, Mr. Schöbro. Now, Mrs. Morvai.
Köszönöm szépen, miközben az Európai Unió tonnaszám
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. The European Union produces a huge pile of documents on violence against women and trafficking of women. At the same time, there are a whole number of member states where the police are completely indifferent to women's plight. The police commissioner in Budapest has refused to give training courses to the police force on this subject. The Austrian police sparked an outcry because when girls leave Hungary and arrive in Austria, they disappear sometimes in mysterious circumstances, and even months later the Austrian police refuse to launch investigations, even if it is quite clear that there are reasons to suspect that violence has been perpetrated against these women, or these women have been victims of trafficking. So I'd like to know whether you know anything about this and what you intend to do about it. Thank you, Mrs. Morvai. Now, Mr. Boris.
Thank you very much. The prostitution and the execution of proceeds from prostitution is a trans-border problem. More strict and more coherent laws could make it possible to enforce the regulations in a more efficient way, and we should also have exit strategies for women who want to stop prostitution. Indeed, prostitution is often connected with economic hardship, and it is well worth to consider and support this report in order to ensure cooperation between member states in order to fight against organised crime of trans-border nature. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Boris. And finally, Mrs. Haidt.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. In 2011, there was new trafficking legislation in Europe, and some form of crime is now considered to be the case to take place when sex is bought. Now, 2016 is the year when the member states are going to come back to Parliament and report back on how they have combated demand for prostitutes, and it will be very important that this report be investigated. It's not legislation after all. It's a report which says to member states that they need to look into this issue of demand for prostitution.
Vielen Dank, Frau Kollegin.
Thank you, Mrs. Haidt. So that brings us to the end of the Catch the Eye procedure, and Commissioner Georgieva now.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to start with thanks to Ms. Mary Honeyball for her initiative report. There are gruesome consequences of human trafficking and exploitation, stories of deception of young girls and women having to sell their bodies, threatened, beaten, sometimes even sold by their own families. And I want to start by very clearly stating that for us in the EU, human trafficking is unacceptable in every sense. It is a gross human rights violation, and it is an extremely serious form of crime. We often hear that trafficking is underground or hidden crime, but we actually see it with our eyes. It happens in front of our eyes. And those who are not so very well seen are the criminals who control it in the background. We also understand very well the interconnection between gender and trafficking. Eurostat shows that 96% of victims of trafficking for sexual exploitation are women and girls. And behind the statistics is the tragedy of each and every one of them, and actually this connects very much with the discussion we had on the previous item on the report presented by Mrs. Parvanova. We recognise also that women and children end up in the prostitution market not by choice of their own, that there is a link between the prostitution market, exploitation and organised crime. These links are indisputable, are becoming more and more evident. What's more, Europol informs us that most of the victims of sexual exploitation are trafficked to countries where prostitution is legal or is regulated. As I have already stressed in the previous discussion, the EU has adopted both a very ambitious directive on human trafficking and a new strategy to complement this directive. Both recognise and address the gender dimension and the need to reduce demand on human trafficking for the first time at EU law level. And this is where I want to end. Prevention is a key pillar of this directive, and it is recognised that there is a need to reduce demand for sexual exploitation. For a little 10-year-old girl to be exploited in the prostitution market or for producing pornography, there has to be a client and there has to be an user. And thus we have to focus strongly on tackling, diminishing, eliminating this demand. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Frau Kommissarin.
Thank you, Commissioner Georgieva. That completes the debate. The vote will be at 11:30 tomorrow. Last item on the agenda this evening is the SIA report on the delegation of legislative powers and the Commission's exercise of implementing powers. I'll give the floor first of all to the rapporteur for 4 minutes.
Szépen, elnök